Good afternoon. This is Tuesday, November 17th, the last day of in-person classes, at least for a while. Hopefully not too far in the future, we will be back together. I want to do a follow-up to EM5 and EM6, Energy and Matter 5, Energy and Matter 6, since we've been hustled out of the building quickly and really didn't get a chance to fully engage in the activity completely. I want to make sure we have a basic understanding of the cycle. So in EM5, we looked at two cycles, the carbon cycle and the water cycle. The carbon cycle and the water cycle cover the top three elements, the three most common elements: oxygen, 60-some%, carbon, 20 to 30-some%, and hydrogen, 10 to 15% of all living organisms and of the human body. Remind you that you need carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen to build all four macromolecules. You want to make a protein, you need carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. You want to make a carbohydrate, you need carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. You want to make a lipid, you need carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. You want to make a nucleic acid, you need carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. You cannot build any of the four major macromolecules, nor the fifth major structural molecule, water, without carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Obviously, the water, you don't need the carbon, but you need these elements. Without the four macromolecules, we don't have the building blocks we need to build our body, and we do not have a way to properly transfer energy from organism to organism. So life doesn't exist if we don't have access to carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Since these elements are so critical, nature has set up cycles to make sure that this material is recycled and reused on a regular basis. Because remember, it's a fixed resource. It's a finite resource. As far as we understand the world, there is no new sources of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen coming to planet Earth or leaving Earth. We have what we have. We got to make it work. We have to recycle it. In the EM6, we take a look at the fourth major element, which is nitrogen. So between carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, these four elements make up 96.2% of the human body. Nitrogen is needed for two of the macromolecules. If you want to make carbohydrates and lipids, you don't need the nitrogen. But if you want to make protein, which is your major structural molecule, your building molecule, or you want to make nucleic acids, your genetic information, you must have nitrogen. No nitrogen, no ability to build cells, no ability to make DNA, therefore no ability for cells to reproduce. Growth is not possible. So again, just like with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, nitrogen has a cycle set up in nature to make sure that nitrogen is cycled and reused and readily available for living organisms. So let me jump first into the carbon and water cycle and just sort of summarize the key parts of this process. So I'm just going to go to our whiteboard in the classroom, and I've got an image up on the board that will try to explain the key steps. All right. The artwork is primitive, but hopefully the ideas will come across pretty smoothly. So I'm going to step around here. So from the water end of things, water ends up in the atmosphere two different ways. So one, the most common way, of course, is through evaporation. During evaporation, water heats up in a liquid form, and as it heats up, the molecules spread out, and they end up forming water vapor, a gas form. There's a second way that we can put water in the atmosphere significantly, and that is through plants. Plants have a process called transpiration. And transpiration is basically the evaporation of water from a plant. The transpiration from plants makes up about 10% of the water in the atmosphere. And so that also contributes to water vapor. As this water vapor accumulates in the atmosphere and with the air molecules, it rises. And as it rises, the air cools. And as the air cools, it condenses into clouds. Call this condensation. condense condensation into the clouds, which means the water vapor, the molecules start to condense back together and they go back from a gas to a liquid. And this is going to form precipitation. Precipitation can take on the form of rain, can take on the form of snow, depending on where you live. And of course, same thing's going to happen out of this cloud. We've got some precipitation. This diagram will end up getting messy, but hopefully you can still follow me. So evaporation, transpiration is how we take water and put it back into the atmosphere. Condensation converts that gas form back into liquid form. And then that precipitation falls back to the earth, either as a liquid or as a solid. And when liquid comes back to earth, it's going to basically do one of two things. Some of that liquid is going to infiltrate the ground. We call it infiltration. Infiltration is when water goes into the ground, seeps into the ground, and that makes it accessible to plants who will absorb that water through their roots. And some of that water can continue to penetrate deeper. We call that percolating. Both infiltration and percolate are good ways for cleaning the water. And when it percolates, it goes even further in the ground and it ends up gathering and forming groundwater, which is a good source of water for humans. So in a healthy environment, most of your rainwater, most of your snow melt should hopefully infiltrate and go into the soil, making it accessible to plants, replenishing the groundwater. And as it moves through the soil and percolates and infiltrates, it's a good way to clean the water. A certain percentage of the water, when it hits the ground, will actually do what's called surface runoff. Surface runoff means it's going to go with the slope of the ground, and it's going to quickly move across the ground and find the low points, which usually are at your rivers, your streams, your lakes, your ponds. With surface runoff, the water usually is moving at a fairly quick pace, so it does pick up debris and materials and carries that debris and materials into the waterways. That could be excess nutrients, that could be excess fertilizers. There are some problems that can happen due to surface runoff. In cities where you have a lot of concrete, surface runoff becomes a big issue because the water moves really fast and you end up washing a lot of unwanted things into the waterways. So this is sort of the water end of it. Then when we talk about the carbon end of this, we start to get into the living organisms, the plants, the humans, and the animals. All right, so let's start the story from there. So plants are where it usually starts. So plants are taking in water. And the other thing plants are going to take in out of the atmosphere is CO2. CO2 is going to come into the plants. Water is going to go into the plants. And of course, it's going to absorb some sunlight, and it's going to use that energy from the sunlight to combine carbon dioxide and water and form sugars, organic molecules. So we'll show these two things coming in. And basically, I don't want to go into the ground. Basically, they produce organic molecules, typically glucose. Doesn't have to be glucose, but that's typically what happens. Humans then take in the glucose, or animals take in the glucose. Yes? All right. And they take in oxygen. Well, remember, during photosynthesis, if you don't know, during photosynthesis, it's taking in CO2, but it's giving off oxygen. And so humans take in that oxygen, animals take in that oxygen, they take in the glucose, and they combine the glucose with the oxygen, and what they end up doing is they end up releasing carbon dioxide and water vapor. as that just got a little bit confusing, I realize on the drawing. So to make it one more time, hopefully clear, photosynthesis is the process we use to take water from the environment, typically the soil, and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So there's my carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Using the sun's energy, we recombine those two molecules into organic macromolecules, proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. One of the more common products is glucose. That's our primary energy source. So the hydrogen, the oxygen, and the carbons are all in this glucose molecule. The glucose gets passed on to consumers like humans and animals. Using oxygen from the atmosphere, which was released from photosynthesis, the humans and animals break that glucose down back into CO2 and water vapor. So photosynthesis takes carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen out of the environment, puts it into a usable form, macromolecules. Respiration takes the macromolecule, breaks it down to release energy, and puts the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen back in the environment. Photosynthesis removes the elements from the environment to build macromolecules. Respiration breaks down the macromolecules and releases the elements back into the environment. In the process, they produce ATP, which is an energy that they both need to run on. That's the connecting piece between the water cycle and the carbon cycle. Photosynthesis uses both carbon and water. Respiration uses both carbon and water. That's the connecting piece. Now, we also contribute to this because eventually plants and animals die. And when plants and animals die, their bodies decompose. And when we decompose, we release carbon into the soil. This is called deposition. Deposition is the release of carbon into the soil, which over time turns into fossil fuel. Over time, that turns into fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are stored forms of carbon and hydrogen, hydrocarbons. Fossil fuels are things like coal, natural gas, oil. Well, humans in the last century particularly, we found a way to take these fossil fuels and dig them up and put them to use, like running our automobiles, running factories, all those types of things. The problem is when you take this solid fossil fuels or liquid fossil fuels from the ground and you use them in automobiles and factories, they typically get converted back into gaseous CO2. Some of that CO2 will end up mixing with the rainwater. I'm going to take some of it over here. Some of it mixes in with the rainwater and it forms carbonic acid. It's going to form carbonic acid, which is H2CO3. And carbonic acid can fall into the local waterways and cause what we call acidification. Particularly if you're talking about oceans, this is a big problem for coral reefs. So as we burn more fossil fuels, we create more carbon dioxide. More carbon dioxide leads to the production of more carbonic acid, which leads to a drop in pH in forests and oceans and all types of environments. On the upside, if this weak carbonic acid is in small amounts, it helps break down rocks and build up soil. But right now we're producing too much. The other thing that CO2 can do, CO2 can also directly go into the water. Just a reminder, this is CO2. CO2 can go directly into the water. And when it goes directly into the water, it can form what's called calcium carbonate. So there's calcium, all right, and carbonate, CO2. So it forms calcium carbonate, which is used by corals and oysters and clams to build their shells. their shells or their skeletons. Well, when those oysters and clams and corals die, their skeletons fall to the bottom of the ocean into the sediments, and that releases carbon into the sediments. We call that sedimentation, and ultimately usually results in the formation of limestone. So you can see these two cycles get pretty complex and pretty involved. So if I was looking at it, I'd look at it sort of in 4 chunks. There's the water portion of the cycle, which is the evaporation, transpiration, condensation, precipitation, the one you've probably learned since grade school. Just make sure you also understand water's got 2 routes when it comes back. It can infiltrate and percolate, which is the preferred route, or it can run off. Second major chunk is the carbon cycle, which involves photosynthesis and respiration. Photosynthesis uses both water and carbon dioxide to make macromolecules, and then respiration reverses that process by breaking the macromolecules back into carbon dioxide and water. In the process, photosynthesis stores energy, respiration releases energy. The third step is organisms die. Their carbon builds up in the soil through deposition and forms fossil fuels. And one of the recent problems we have is we're pulling that fossil fuel out very rapidly and converting it to energy, which is producing excess CO2, which is what's contributing to climate change, ocean acidification, and a number of other issues. And when the fourth one is when carbon dioxide mixes in water. 1, it can change the pH. 2, it can build up calcium carbonate, which is necessary for building the shells and the skeletons of organisms, which leads to the buildup of limestone, which is not necessarily a negative one. So those are sort of the major components of the carbon water cycle. I'm going to pause the video at this point and get ready to briefly talk about the nitrogen cycle. We'll be back. Okay, welcome back. We now have a new diagram on the board, and we're going to talk a little bit about the nitrogen cycle. So the nitrogen cycle, nitrogen comes in several different forms. Some forms are usable by organisms, other forms are not usable by organisms. So let's start where most of the nitrogen is. Most of the nitrogen is in the atmosphere. About 80% of the nitrogen, about 80% of the atmosphere is N2, which is dinitrogen gas. The problem is that 80% nitrogen, almost no living organisms can use it outside of a select handful of bacteria. So that nitrogen is not readily available. So what has to happen is in the soil, we have these nitrogen fixing bacteria. And this nitrogen fixing bacteria are able to take the nitrogen out of the atmosphere, and they are able to convert it into usable forms. Something that we call nitrates and ammonium. These are the 2 usable forms of nitrogen. This process of converting atmospheric nitrogen into nitrates and ammonia is called nitrogen fixation. It is a critical process to the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen fixation is the ability to pull nitrogen out of the air and turn it into usable, biologically usable forms called nitrates and ammonium. Now, some plants have an advantage. I've got 2 types of plants here. I've got corn and I've got soybeans. Soybeans are what's called legumes. Legumes are types of plants that have nodules that house beneficial bacteria. Other ones would include clovers, peas, but these little balls that I've got on the roots here, these are called nodules. And these nodules contain bacteria. They contain nitrogen fixing bacteria. So the soybean has a real advantage because the soybean can directly pull this nitrogen gas out of the air. They can turn it into nitrates, and then the nitrogen can go into the plant. Whereas corn has no nodules. Corn cannot trap nitrogen around its roots. It depends on the free living nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soil, and it has to absorb it from the surrounding areas. Therefore, corn is a big nitrogen sucker. It takes a lot of nitrogen to grow corn because it has no ability to produce and trap its own nitrogen like the soybeans do. You may have heard of crop rotation. One of the ideas with crop rotation is if you grow corn on a field in one year, it's going to strip it of most of its nitrogen. So the next year you should put in soybeans or some other legume that will help put nitrogen back in the soil. So alternating between these two crops is quite common. So the key is you got to get this into a usable form. The usable forms are nitrates or ammonium. Once you have it in usable forms, the plants can absorb it through their roots. Some plants have a leg up because they have nodules which contain this key bacteria and can therefore have greater access to the nitrogen. Another source of this is you have dead organisms. This is some poor rabbit that died and his body is laying on the ground, and different types of decomposers are going to take his body and they're going to break it down. And in the process of breaking down the body, they will eventually convert some of the composition of this dead rabbit's body into nitrates and ammonium. So that's another source of usable nitrates that become available to plants in this process. Okay, a small amount of nitrate can be converted through lightning. Right, lightning strikes provide an energy, and a small amount of dinitrogen gas can be converted into nitrates. It's not significant, but it is another factor. And so you got to get the nitrates available. Once you have the nitrates available, plants can convert those nitrates into proteins. And DNA. And once the plants make the proteins, now the humans and the animals eat the plants and they get the amino acids from the proteins and they've got access to the nitrogens. And all of these, remember, are going to use this nitrogen to make DNA and protein. That's why we need the nitrogen. That's why we need the nitrogen. We need nitrogen to make the DNA and the protein. This process of incorporating the nitrogen into your body and making proteins and DNA is called assimilation. Very same name that we use for being able to take carbon out of food and assimilate the carbon in your body. Assimilation is the ability to take building blocks from your food and use it to build your body. So we're going to be taking nitrogens in the form of proteins out of these corn and the soybeans, and we're going to be using that to build our bodies. That's assimilation. Or we're going to eat another animal who ate the plants and use its proteins to assimilate and build our own proteins. As we mentioned already, nitrogen is a key factor in the fertilizer world. So humans may assist this process. So if this is the farmer, he can assist this process by adding fertilizer. Fertilizer is going to put more nitrates into the soil and going to increase the amount of nitrates available. The problem is if you put too much fertilizer in it, some of it goes on when we have rain. Remember, we have runoff. And what happens on the runoff is we end up getting excess nitrogen into the water. And when you start getting too much nitrogen in the water, it causes excessive plant growth and you start getting what's called an algae bloom. You get these big, thick sheets of algae that become very thick and gooey on the surface of the water. They suck up the oxygen and you end up with a large fish kill. So this is called an algal bloom. There's been a lot of problems with this down near Toledo and the southern part of Michigan on Lake Erie the last 4 or 5 years. So fertilizers can supplement the nitrates. Fertilizers, particularly for something like corn, which needs an awful lot of it, can help us produce more corn. But if we're over fertilizing, we're putting too much fertilizer in the soil. When the rain comes through and washes off, it's going to put that excess fertilizer into the water system, and that excess fertilizer in the water system wreaks havoc. It leads to something called eutrophication, which leads to something called the algal bloom. And that algal bloom is not good for the fish. It ends up depleting the water of oxygen, and we have fish kills and other problems that take place. Another factor in this cycle is something called denitrifying bacteria. You want these guys. You want the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. The nitrogen-fixing bacteria are desirable. Those are the ones you want. They're good for the soil. They're good for the plants. These are the guys you want to avoid, the denitrifying bacteria. Denitrifying bacteria usually survive in very damp, wet soils that are low in oxygen. This is why farmers put a lot of time and energy into draining their fields and making sure they've got good drainage. Their soils aren't bogged down with lots of extra moisture and it's really mucky. Because when you get really damp, mucky soils, it benefits the denitrifying bacteria versus the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And what the denitrifying bacteria do is reverse the whole process. You take the nitrates and the ammonias through denitrifying bacteria, and it puts it back into the atmosphere. So you're taking usable nitrogen and putting it back into non-usable form. So this is something you don't want to have happen. You do not want denitrifying bacteria. And one of the primary ways you prevent denitrification is by having good, well-drained soil. So that sort of gives you a pretty good overview of the process. Again, I would break this down into chunks. The main goal is to take the nitrogenous gas N2 and using nitrogen-fixing bacteria either in the soil or in the nodules, convert it into nitrates and ammonium. Nitrates and ammonium can be absorbed by the roots. Plants can convert that into proteins and DNA. Humans and animals eat the plants. They get the protein and the DNA. They can make their own, assimilate and make their own protein and DNA, and everybody's happy. On a smaller scale, lightning can produce a small amount of nitrates. Decomposition of dead animals and waste products creates some nitrates and ammonium. Those all need to be there. Humans have learned to supplement the natural cycle by using fertilizers. The problem, whether it's a farmer or whether it's you at home using it on your lawn and over applying it, is too much fertilizer leads to algal blooms, which is deadly for aquatic systems. And finally, if you don't treat your soil right and you don't keep the soil well drained, you attract these things called denitrifying bacteria, and they reverse the process in the wrong direction. They put the nitrogen back in the atmosphere, and it's no longer available to plants and animals. So that's sort of the quick story on the nitrogen cycle. Hopefully these walkthroughs will help supplement what we did in class. Thank you for your time and attention. Enjoy your evening.